Thank you, Robin, and I'm sorry I messed up where you work. Um, our last speaker is Barbara Hoffman, who's one of the founders of National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship, which is going to talk about employment issues.
Thank you, Shelley. So for the entire day, we've talked about an awful lot of different consequences of cancer, not just on somebody's physical health, but on all these different topics. I'm going to take a slightly different look at all these different topics, and that's how cancer really impacts the legal consequences of an individual's life. I may need help with this. There we go. Okay. So cancer really impacts, as we've talked about, virtually everything, right? It can impact whether you keep your job, what is the quality of your job, everything about your employment. It can impact your ability to get a good education and to get something out of your education. Just had a great talk about the tremendous financial impact of cancer. Cancer can cause housing insecurity for a number of people because that's tied into financial. It can cause transportation problems, as we just saw the data on that. We could spend weeks on the insurance impact of cancer, health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance. We talked about the role of dependent care. One of the things we didn't talk about today was end-of-life planning. All of these topics have legal implications. And the legal implications just layer on one more problem that survivors have to deal with. So I'm going to talk about mostly just two of them. But everything keeps coming full circle. So the legal issues have a medical impact. We've talked about the negative medical impact. When people are faced with the legal consequences of cancer, we've got data that shows they don't get treatment the way they otherwise could. It's the stress, it's the financial impact of it, that legal problems affect people's ability to get adequate treatment. Because of that, it also affects the quality of life. Legal problems add to stress. They add to family problems because you're not just treating one person, you're treating a whole family and their friends. So there's this sort of multidisciplinary impact of cancer that impacts legal. I'm just going to talk about two of those issues, employment and education, but if we had all day, we'd talk about the other ones. So sort of the brief legal course, cancer survivors' employment rights. Before 1990, when I would talk about cancer survivors' employment rights, we spent most of the time talking about problems, and we didn't have a lot of good solutions. But we've slowly seen pretty good solutions, though they're not panaceas. So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. That helped change some things. But until then, we didn't have a lot of patient advocacy. Survivors didn't have a lot of rights. And there weren't very many legal resources that were even in tune to understanding survivors had legal needs. We needed to address those rights. Got better in 1990 when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed for a number of different ways. First, the ADA not only created a legal right that prohibited some types of employment discrimination, it also educated people. Survivors became more empowered because survivors started learning they did have rights at work. They had a right not to be fired. They had a right to get accommodations. We also saw an increase in how employers reacted. Employers, smarter employers than Kim Hall Jackson had, knew you cannot discriminate, knew it was more practical, more productive to provide a reasonable accommodation. And just by having the law, we saw incidences of employment discrimination go down, so that would help. But there were some problems. The way the Americans with Disabilities Act was written, it covered people with disabilities. And other than the little bit of language that the NCCS and a few other patient groups got in about cancer survivors in the ADA, most of the law wasn't really addressed to cancer survivors. And the problem was it was written in a way that if you were so sick you had a disability, but if you were that sick because of your cancer prevented you from being able to work, so you weren't protected by the law anyway. So some cancer survivors found themselves in a catch-22. In addition to the catch-22 from the law, we really didn't have a network of helping people with their legal needs. So we didn't have lawyers and social workers focusing on the legal impact of cancer. Things got a little better again in 2008. In 2008, the ADA was amended, and it was changed so that it made it easier for people to say, I'm covered by the law. So pretty much the way we got the law rewritten covers all cancer survivors. You don't have to be so sick you can't go to work. You simply had to have a cancer history and you're basically covered by the law. So it shifted from you have to prove you're covered to how is the law going to protect me? And that's really what the point of the law was anyway. So now most cases for cancer survivors were about getting an accommodation and getting rights under the law, not just being covered by it. And what it meant is the number of people who filed complaints with federal agencies, and the main federal agency is the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. They could get their foot in the door and they could get a hearing officer to hear their case and to try to work something out. So expanding the law really sort of opened the legal doors for survivors. It also opened the courtroom for survivors because they weren't just thrown out of court as being somebody who didn't really have a disability. So that in turn sort of also helps, the word gets out that when you have more legal rights, employers are less likely to discriminate because they don't want to get sued. So that improved in a lot of ways. Another thing that helped is improvement in patient advocacy. We've really seen in the last 10 to 15 years the growth in patient advocacy through groups like NCCS and other patient advocacy groups. We've seen a growth in patient navigators. So survivors now have people with them helping them deal with things more just beyond are you taking your medication. We've also seen a nice expansion in resources like multidisciplinary clinics, where it's not just oncologists providing care, oncology nurses providing care, but you've got social workers in some cases, you've got attorneys, you've got people with different fields starting to think outside the box, healing the whole patient a little more than that. We've also seen an explosion in legal resources. Now at law schools and in clinics and in medical legal partnerships, we're starting to see more lawyers get involved to provide resources to survivors. And I'll get back to that one in a minute. So in general, we've seen a pretty good expansion of legal rights. In terms of employment rights, the sort of basic laws are the Americans with Disabilities Rights, the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and some state laws. And I'll give you the 1-minute law course on each one of these. We talked about the ADA just briefly. It's done a lot of great things in that it has provided a means for cancer survivors to insist on reasonable accommodations, to insist on being treated based on your ability to do your work, not a label of having a disability, having cancer. So that's the good news. It covers all employers who have at least 15 workers. So that's sort of the good news, but as Kathy Bradley just said, the workplace is shifting. So it remains to be seen, are we going to need to try to amend the law again to make sure people are covered in the new economy? It's enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the best thing about the ADA for cancer survivors is that mandate that if you're able to work, you are entitled to an accommodation that enables you to do your job. So it's not, you can have an accommodation only if you can show you have a disability. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter if you have a cane. None of that matters. It's if you have the need for some type of reasonable accommodation, the law mandates that unless it provides some unsafe situation. I mean, it's pretty hard for an accommodation to not be reasonable. Most common accommodations that survivors take, as we discussed, time off. You need time off to go to the doctor. You need time off for treatment. You need time off for follow-up care. You can be 2 or 3 years past your diagnosis, past your initial treatment. You still need time off to go for all these follow-up scans and blood work and medical appointments. So that's really key for survivors to be able to keep their jobs, but still get the necessary care and follow-up work care. Flexible work hours are another kind of accommodation. You may need a few days off in a month or 1 day off a week. It depends when, right? Your doctor does not necessarily give you office hours at 7 in the morning or 10 o'clock at night or on weekends. So you might need some time off. Flexible work time is another kind of accommodation. Maybe you just need a little bit of time to rest. That can be an accommodation too. So the ADA is really useful in that it provides all these different types of accommodations. The other law that survivors use is the Family and Medical Leave Act. A little more restrictive. It only applies to employers who have at least 50 employers. Again, we don't all work for big employers. The good news is it requires up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for yourself, or if you're a caregiver, to care for a spouse or to care for a child who has a serious medical condition. Most of the time, the cancer diagnosis does meet that definition of a serious medical definition. So that part's pretty good. If your employer gives you a better package, gives you more leave time than the FMLA gives you, then you're entitled to that. So the Leave Act is just sort of base. The disadvantage is it doesn't require paid leave. We're one of the few countries left in the Western world where we don't have paid leave. Congress has tried to amend that, doesn't ever get anywhere. You would get paid leave depending on your state law, you'd get paid leave depending on your employer. And then another federal law known as GINA, the Genetic Information Nondiscrimination Act, prohibits discrimination based on the results of a genetic test. It does not prohibit discrimination based on the fact that you've had cancer and you have genetic testing and you've tested positively. The point of the law is to encourage people to get genetic testing so you can be proactive in your health care based on your genetic test and not be disadvantaged at work, not have that information disclosed because you got a test and whatever the results of that test happen to be. So that law also protects cancer survivors at work. And there's state laws. We have 50 state laws. They're all pretty different, but some of them are even better than federal laws. Some of them are not so helpful. Every state has something like the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that it prohibits some kind of workplace discrimination. All of these laws will require some kind of reasonable accommodations. Some progressive states like California and New Jersey have much better laws than the federal law. Some other states, some southern states, and I'm from the South, so I can rag on that, have terrible laws and they don't really provide that much protection. Some state laws provide medical leave and provide more medical leave than a lot of employers would allow or the federal government allows, and they can be useful. Some states also have privacy laws that are sort of paired with GINA, but they may provide some more information and some more help. So there's layering of all these legal rights for cancer survivors out there. So that's sort of the summary of cancer and work. Cancer also impacts the ability of someone to receive a quality education. We've talked a lot about the late effects of cancer. We've talked about the impact of cancer on young adults and how that affects them in life. And a lot of these impacts affect what they can do at their education. So especially for young adults, the late effects of radiation and chemo and surgery, you can have neurocognitive deficits, growth retardation, cardiac dysfunction. We've spent a lot of time talking about second and third and fourth malignancies, fatigue, psychological impact. Layer all that on to somebody who is a full-time student. It can make it very difficult to be a full-time student. But survivors do have some rights to help them get through school despite these problems. If you are young, you're age 3 to 21, the law that protects you is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. What that does is it requires schools to have an individual education plan to tailor whatever is necessary for that survivor. These plans are developed by multidisciplinary teams, and there should be somebody on the team of a pediatric survivor who knows about all these impacts of pediatric cancer treatment. So they would develop a team to help do whatever's necessary for that student. When you age out of that protection and you're in college or in grad school, you're covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Both of these laws require individually tailored accommodations to help the survivor be able to go to school. And that could be something simple like needing a break at school, needing extra time for an exam, maybe needing an aide to go to school with you, take notes, open doors, recording lesson plans. Whatever it is, it's got to be individually tailored, but that helps survivors a lot. So now I just want to sort of sum up with where we're going. And I guess I want to start with the bad news because I don't want to end on good news. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen here. So nobody's really talked too much about what's going on down the street. All these agencies I've talked about, like the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, these are the agencies that enforce these laws. And they've done a pretty good job about enforcing these laws and protecting survivors' rights. We are hearing a lot of chatter now that different agencies like the EEOC, the Department of Labor, the Department of Education are going to start pulling back on enforcement and just sort of quietly not doing anything and making it more difficult for survivors and everybody else to enforce their rights. Well, time is going to tell about that. There's been some chatter about legislation to weaken genetic privacy laws and other privacy laws, and we've seen in the press that there's some fights about what your right to privacy should be in the future. That can have a big impact on cancer survivors. We have a new Department of Education secretary who, when she testified in her hearing to be nominated for the Secretary of Education, did not know what the Individual with Disabilities Education Act even was. So we're a little concerned about how much she's going to protect the rights of pediatric survivors. And finally, legal services. Most cancer survivors who are in the financial distress that we've just talked about don't really have the money to deal with these legal problems. They rely on public legal services. Legal services are being scaled back. So let's end on something positive, please. This is what's getting better, and you guys are the evidence of that, right? Huge increase in advocacy and in education dealing with cancer survivorship, right? We have patient-led advocacy. We have all your professional information and studies further support the patient advocacy, support why we need it. The survivorship research is critical to all this. We have a growth of multidisciplinary responses, right? Now we're all here from all these different disciplines. We need these multidisciplinary responses. One of them is medical legal partnerships. We're seeing a growth in, as Neeraj talked about, you need a patient home. When we're providing cancer services, to provide all these holistic services, to bring either physically to the place or all connected through resources, the legal resources that survivors need to help answer the questions that they have. So when they face legal problems, how do you deal with them? And strategy and advocacy for trying to avoid a lot of these problems, because avoiding them is certainly less disruptive and more effective. Finally, we just need multidisciplinary training. We talked about that a little bit too, and just don't forget the lawyers. They're part of it too. So when people do training, right, we think about what we know. Doctors think about the doctor's response, and nurses think about the nurse's response. We all need to be in the same room together. We all need to plan together. We need really holistic solutions to all this, because as we started talking at the very beginning, we're not talking about a disease, we're talking about people. So when we start planning the next step forward for all this cancer care, It needs to be coordinated. It needs to be holistic so that we're treating whole people, so that we're treating their medical health, their physical health, their mental health, their financial health, and their legal health. Thank you.